The coffin caught fire before the eulogy finished, flames licking the polished oak like some cheap, grotesque theater trick, and Jonas stepped back as if the heat could scorch his memory of her father into something simpler. Mara felt the world tilt, a bucket of rain and grief and engine oil dumping cold over her shoulders. She clutched her belly and watched him. The man who had promised steadiness walked straight through the circle of brothers and out into the downpour without a backward glance. His jacket, the one that smelled of grease and soap, and the small kindnesses he kept like tools in his pockets, hung from his shoulders like a surrendered flag. He did not run. He left. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The rain turned the strip outside the funeral hall into a mirror, tire tracks and neon signs smudged into silver. People clustered under awnings and the old banners strung like bunting across the pavement, faces drawn and lit by something harsher than the weather: anger, curiosity, relief. Men in cut-off denim and patched leather looked like statues, the club's oval patched across their backs weighing more than cloth. Widow's black hugged Mara, though she felt like a stranger wearing someone else's grief. 6 months in, the baby inside her swung softly against her spine, a secret engine, and she felt both unbearably full and hollow. Silas Rowe came to her like an undertow. He didn't look like a man softened by sympathy. He looked like a man who had already figured the arithmetic of loss. His jaw was granite, scarred where his father had once struck him with a wrench in a fight no one recalled clearly, but everyone swore shaped him. He stopped directly in front of Mara, with the club's deference acting like a current around him. "Kincaid," he said, and his voice had all of the unspoken clauses of the road. "You'll take what's yours." "What's mine?" Mara heard the sarcasm and the rawness in her own voice as if it came from someone beside her. Her throat had been a river of cigarette smoke and stolen lullabies. She had been raised to mirror silence. She had learned to honor the patch like scripture, to keep her shoulders squared when men breathed like storms. But she had not learned how to answer when the world rearranged itself with fire. Silas's eyes flicked to Jonah's receding shape, then back. "Your father left a trust, accounted, fenced, probated. $500 million, Mara. Legit, not just cash stuffed in a mattress. Businesses, shell companies, a real ledger. The Kincaid name will mean more now than the patch. The board thinks." His mouth tightened. "The board wants you to place that money where it'll keep the club whole." "Place it where?" She forced the laugh out of her like iron filings from a wound. "Into the club's pockets? Into the strip's bills? Into whatever front keeps us respectable? He's dead, Silas. He burned up. He couldn't want." "He wanted continuity," Silas interrupted. "He wanted someone with the name to be able to steer it. The will's clear. A Kincaid steward. Not the club, not the corporation. Steward. He trusted the bloodline to save the rest. You can do it, Mara. You're—" His look flinched at the belly, as if it would make her soft. "You're his only heir." Her father's funeral smell, diesel, whiskey, gun oil, had been the air she breathed growing up. She could still see him at the strip, hunched over a battered bar, telling stories to anyone who would listen, and carving the edges off truth with laughter. He'd been a legend in patches she hadn't thought to capital. She had loved him fiercely and faultlessly. The idea that his legacy could be tallied into numbers and accounts felt like sacrilege and salvation at once. The chaplain's voice tapered off, lost beneath the hubbub. A man from a probate firm, slick, smelling faintly of too sweet cologne, handed her an envelope. Her fingers were clumsy. The paper trembled. The seal broke with a sound like a small animal dying, and inside was a thick packet of legalese, signatures, and the ledger attached, account numbers, trust names, corporations with respectable names that hid darker ledgers. She felt the weight of every entry like a fist against her sternum. Jonah had been the kind of lover who repaired more than carburetors. He mended windows with soot-caked hands, whispered silly jokes when the world asked for stoicism, and pressed his thumb against her pulse as if to map grief. He'd said yes at the Strip, under a sky full of burned-out neon, and the congregation of men who'd raised him like a son. He'd tried to belong by learning to fix anything, to make himself small and useful, to never be a problem. She remembered the first time he slid a wrench across her father's knee, only to have the old man grin and hand him his first patch, an acceptance he'd earned not by blood but sweat. When he left like someone refusing to be a martyr for a patch he could never join. He walked out into the rain with his head down, and the club did not stop him. They let him go, as if to spare the Kincaid Mame more chaos, or because they knew better than anyone that sometimes leaving was an act of mercy. Mara's stomach dropped a half-inch and lodged where the baby was. The betrayal was a clean blade. She wondered whether she hated him for his cowardice, or whether she simply wanted to shake him until he remembered how to be brave. Silas took her wrist then, not roughly, but certainly with intent. "We can put the money into the Strip, into safer ventures, real estate, logistics. We can make the Kincaid chapter unassailable. But you won't be able to run it alone." His thumb rubbed a map of calluses into her skin. "You'll need counsel. You'll need men who know ledgers, men who will listen." "You mean men who'll take my name and sign the papers?" she said. She hated the dryness of her words, the way they buckled under their own truth. "And what part do I have in all of this? To stamp it with my face?" "It's stewardship, Mara. Control with oversight." He was careful, like a man threading a needle over a lit fuse. "Not ownership, not carnival. The club protects its own. This could make the club untouchable if placed right. My father's ledger has enemies." The sentence escaped before she could wrap it. He hadn't just been rich, he'd been dangerous. She'd seen the way other chapters' patches had watched him, the way men who used to smile had stopped. There were entries in the ledger that suggested payments with no recipients, transfers that evaporated into shell companies and then into places named for dead things. She thought of men she'd loved who had disappeared into other gangs' territories like ghosts. He was careful. He never mixed his jokes with his money. If his money is out now, if the trust is real, people will come. Silas's expression was unreadable. They'll come anyway. The difference is whether they're trying to take the club or buy it. If you put money into legal portfolios, you can buy neutrality. You can pay off rusted enemies or start new businesses. You can give the club stability. You want me to give the club stability. Her voice was smaller than the rage that sat in her like a pit. You want me to hand over my father's name and his money to keep the patch intact? To make it harder for people like Jonah to leave? Silas paused. Thunder rippled over the Strip, shadows moving like specters. People murmured. She felt 100 eyes on her like a jury. "You'll have a seat," he said finally. "You'll have a voice, but you can't act like a girl with nothing to lose. There are rival patches sniffing already. The will makes you a beacon. You can be a lighthouse showing the way or a bonfire that draws predators." Mara's laugh was a poor thing, bitter as the coffee she drank at 3 a.m. My father wanted me to be a lighthouse? The notion made the grief in her chest twist. He'd been a man of motorcycles and whiskey, of smirks and brawls. He hadn't seemed the type to leave a child to steer a dynasty. Yet here she was, the ledger in her lap, Jonah's absence like a brand, Silas's hand still warm on her wrist. She thought of the baby, which was the only ledger she hadn't trusted anyone else with. Inside her, a pulse threaded itself into silence and noise. She felt simultaneously like a steward and a trespasser in her own life. Her father had died in fire. The club murmured of accidents and enemies, and a city of men who had sworn loyalty now wanted numbers and signatures. Across the hall, a prospect she'd once fed sandwiches to as he learned to ride straightened his jacket and whispered into his sleeve. A widow she knew from the Strip touched Mara's elbow with a finger that trembled. "They'll want pieces," the woman said. "Don't give them more than you must." Mara nodded because that was what women of the Strip did. We nodded and then went home and counted the hairs on our head and vowed quietly to someone who might never have been able to keep a promise. She folded the ledger into the envelope and felt the weight of it like a newborn who might either be soothed by her arms or crush them. Outside, the rain didn't let up. In the distance, a pack of bikes roared by, chrome flashing like teeth. Jonah's taillights disappeared down the highway and left a smear of red that looked, for a heartbeat, like the map of a heart closing. Mara wrapped her coat tighter. She had a choice with numbers stamped in black ink and men with mouths like locks. She had to decide whether she would be the club's good steward or its saboteur. She had to decide whether she would let Jonah go for safety or drag him back into the inferno. She had been taught that a woman's role in the patch was to hold the home fires steady, literal fires and otherwise, but she had never expected to become the furnace. Her father's ledger smelled like whiskey and gunpowder and the faint puree of legal pad ink. She looked down at the swell of her stomach, at the life that had her father's stubborn jaw and possibly Jonah's soft hands, and felt the line that ran between the road and the law, between love and legacy, stretched taut like a cable. When Silas stepped back, his face was unreadable. Around them, the club's men closed ranks like wolves. Mara swallowed and felt the decision rising in her like heat from the asphalt. She would have to choose. She would have to learn ledgers and lawyers and how to make men who had spent their lives calling the world a battleground hear the idea of balance. The first dilemma settled in like a bruise. Accept the stewardship and become the keeper of a fortune she never wanted, answerable to a club whose blood rules were written in scars and silence, or reject it and watch as rival hands, federal vultures, or even greedy brothers claim the legacy her father had hoarded. Either way, Jonah had walked out, and the road ahead was wet and lit with the glow of something that might burn down, or might warm them all. The first night after the funeral, Mara woke to the sound of a bike idling outside like an animal pacing its cage. Her house smelled of old coffee, the kind her father had favored. Dark, bitter, tolerant of nights. She lay in the dim and listened to the engine, felt the baby kick as if answering a summons she hadn't known she'd heard. Moonlight painted the living room in gray chrome. Photographs of her father leaned against the mantel like witnesses. One showed him in his prime, chest out, cigarette between two fingers, grin wide at the camera as if daring it to catch him truly. Another, softer, showed him holding Mara when she was a toddler and his patched vest huge on him. In both, his hands were the story, stained, steady, stubborn. She dressed before dawn, fingers fumbling with buttons that had never seemed so small. The ledger waited on the kitchen table in the envelope, an accusation and an inheritance. She tucked it under her arm and went outside. The street smelled of rain and old oil and something shed once thought named fate, freedom. A figure sat on a stooped Harley at the curb, hooded, boots planted like someone who'd refused to leave. Jonah. He didn't look up when she approached. He had his jacket on, the same one he'd worn at the funeral, and his hands wrapped around the handlebars as if the bike were a cross he could carry. Dawn silvered his cheekbones. His beard had grown a little, like the map of a man who'd let himself grieve in the open. For a moment, seeing him there, the man who'd walked away and then returned in the cold, felt like the rawest kind of mercy. "You left," Mara said, because it was the opening note between them now. Jonah's voice was low. "I walked because I thought I was doing right." Right for who? The ledger felt hot against her ribs, pulse of paper. The baby punched at her stomach, as if demanding an answer she couldn't give. Who decided you could do right by walking out on me with a child inside me and expecting that to mean anything but abandonment? He flinched, though outwardly he stayed steady like weld work. "You think leaving didn't tear me up? I slept in my truck for a week. I took the long way to work. He didn't finish that word. Neither one of them believed in prayer as a shield these days, not since the strip had taught them harsher things. "I thought, if I stayed, if I tried to claim something I couldn't claim, the club would burn me, or they'd bury you. I thought I could keep you from that."
And what about keeping me from going under, from being swallowed by men who count loyalty by blood and patch? Mara's voice caught like a nail snagging fabric. "My father left me a trust, Jonah. $500 million. He named me steward. The club is already circling like vultures. They expect me to hand that ledger over like a rosary. Silas wants me to place it into club ventures. He says it's for the club's survival, or for its strangling." Jonah's jaw worked. "$500 million," he echoed. "Jesus, how did he manage that?" Carefully, she slid the envelope from beneath her jacket and held it between them. "In businesses that look respectable. He knew how to hide risk in plain sight. But there are dirty lines in it, Jonah. Payments that weren't recorded to people, but to projects no one at the Strip understood. He made enemies by not being sloppy, and now they're all looking." Jonah swallowed. Did you talk to a lawyer?" "2. The trustees' firm sent one of their suits to read the will at the funeral. They said the trust is real, that it's bound and requires a Kincaid steward. But they also said it puts you under microscope, under federal interest, under rival interest." Her voice shook with more than grief. It trembled with the weight of decision. "Silas wants me to put the money into the club's hands, through fronts. He says legality will keep us clean, but he also says the board needs oversight." Jonah's hands tightened on the bars until his knuckles blanched. "He wants you to be a figurehead, to keep the books tidy while the real power stays where it's always been." Mara laughed, a little sound like a match struck and snuffed. "He calls it stewardship. He calls it continuity. He calls it everything a man who wants to keep his hands on something calls things when he wants the thing to stay in his control." "Then don't do it," Jonah said. His voice was hushed, as if he were afraid to wake the ghosts that sat with them on the porch. "Keep control yourself. Get counsel. Get a lawyer who isn't on the club's payroll. Hide the ledger. Move funds out in ways that don't set off alarms. You can keep the kids safe if you make the money a tool, not a trophy." You heard Silas today. Mara pressed her palm flat on the envelope like a stamp of possession. "He and the board will not let me become a tool without strings. They think a woman with a name is less likely to ruin them if they can keep an eye on her. They think I'll fold under pressure. They think I won't know how to fight the kind of wars that were my father's." "Then learn," Jonah said plainly. "Let me help." She studied him, measuring him like a mechanic inspects a new part. Turn it, look for cracks, tap it to hear if it's solid. Jonah's eyes were clear as glass in a storm. There was fear in them, but also something else. Something like resolve. He wanted to protect, yes, but he wanted to protect them together. Not by hiding, but by building a defense. Before she could answer, a rumble cut the air. The distant clip of bikes, closer than should be normal for that hour. "Get a lawyer who isn't on the club's payroll.
Hide the ledger. Move funds out in ways that don't set off alarms. You can keep the kids safe if you make the money a tool, not a trophy. You heard Silas today. Mara pressed her palm flat on the envelope like a stamp of possession. He and the board will not let me become a tool without strings. They think a woman with a name is less likely to ruin them if they can keep an eye on her. They think I'll fold under pressure. They think I won't know how to fight the kind of wars that were my father's. Then learn, Jonas said plainly. Let me help. She studied him, measuring him like a mechanic inspects a new part. Turn it, look for cracks, tap it to hear if it's solid. Jonas' eyes were clear as glass in a storm. There was fear in them, but also something else, something like resolve. He wanted to protect, yes, but he wanted to protect them together. Not by hiding, but by building a defense. Before she could answer, a rumble cut the air, the distant clip of bikes, closer than should be normal for that hour. Silas and two others rolled up, their machines low and white with rain. Silas dismounted with the deliberateness of a man who always controls his narrative. In the pale light, he looked older. The scar on his jaw seemed like a map of debts paid. "You two," he said without preamble. "We need to talk." Jonah straightened. The skin along his throat flashed, like someone realizing he had been dug up and shown to the sun. "We can talk later," Jonah said. "Mara and I are discussing how to secure the trust," Silas cut in. "That's what I thought." His gaze slid to Mara like a judge assessing a defendant's composure. "There's been word. Other clubs sniff. Federal eyes peer. If we don't act, they will take what's ours," Jonah finished for him. His voice had a brittle edge now, as if steel had been tempered and then dropped. "They'll offer Moran money, buy him out. They'll use the Kincaid legacy to buy influence." Silas' expression softened for a moment. "That's right, which is why I'm giving you two the first option to be recognized as stewards under the club's auspices. You will both have input." "Jonah." "No," Mara said, before he could complete the submission. The word shocked them into silence like the crack of a fist on a table. "No, I won't be their figurehead. I won't be a puppet stitched into their history without threads of my own." Silas's eyes narrowed. "You think you can defy the board? You're still raw. You just watched your father burn." "I watched him lead a life where his choices endangered families," Mara replied, feeling heat bloom in her chest. "I watched him keep secrets that men vanish. I won't be a statue for them to point at when things go wrong." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that holds a decision like a weight. Jonah rested the heel of his hand against Mara's lower back, a silent protest, a claim. Silas shifted, weighing her words, like someone balancing a ledger. "Then be clear," he said finally. "If you refuse, you will make enemies, not only outside this chapter, but within. There are men who have eyes on the money for reasons that will not be pretty. And the federal thing isn't rumor. There are whispers. Your father's accounts touched businesses that require explanations. If you choose to move alone, we won't stop you. But you will have to move faster than you ever thought possible." Mara looked at Jonah. He looked back, the morning light highlighting the line of worry between his brows. The ledger lay safe beneath her hand, but the danger felt immediately around it like a swarm. "What do you suggest?" Jonah asked. He seemed younger suddenly, like a man who had been given the map to a place he feared. Silas considered. "You need counsel that isn't patched to us, an outside firm with muscle. You need to split the trust into holdings that are visible and invisible, public-facing companies that will accept money, and smaller trusts that will handle private investments. You need to start moving assets into secure accounts, into foundations perhaps. And above all, you need allies. The board will tolerate a Kincaid if that Kincaid doesn't wreck things." "Allies," Mara repeated. The word tasted like ash. You want me to make friends with men who view me like a ledger? You want me to buy safety with my father's name? I want you safe, Jonah said simply. And I want our kid to inherit a world where their name isn't shorthand for danger. His hand covered hers on the envelope, a small fortification. Let me help you. She felt the room tilt between them again. Jonah offering partnership, Silas offering counsel wrapped in authority, the ledger gleaming with all its dangerous promise. Outside, a rider coughed as he started his bike, the sound like someone sharpening a weapon. The choice wasn't clear. To refuse Silas could mean a war of edges, reputations, and possibly lives. To accept was to hand over the kingdom she had never claimed and never wanted. One thing, Silas said, softer this time. If you intend to handle this yourself, if you intend to defy the council, you'll have to take precautions. Prospects, sergeants, men loyal to you need to be identified. If anyone gets a sniff of this and moves to act, I'll not be a figurehead, Mara said again, voice like a promise and like a threat. But I also will not let my baby's future be a battlefield. We do this clean, quiet, under the radar until we can protect ourselves. She thought of Jonah's hands, his quiet courage that had refused to be loud. She thought of Silas's steady control, the way he held danger like a carved bone. We make a plan. We pick allies outside the patch's immediate board. We secure legal counsel who won't bend to a club's wishes. And we prepare for whatever men will do to get at the money.
Silas nodded slowly. You have until the week is out. The board meets Thursday. We make the plan public otherwise. If you prepare and present a strategy, we'll be able to support it. If you don't, the board will act to protect itself. Mara's laugh this time had edges, expectations, timelines. The club wants me bound by schedules it assigns, as if grief follows bylaws. Grief doesn't, Jonah said, but enemies do. They were a triangle then. Mara at the apex, Jonah and Silas forming the base. Each offered protection, each held power, each carried scars. Mara thought of her father again, the ledger open on the bar one night as he counted out bills and muttered like a man reciting a prayer. He'd always told her the road required choices. You had to decide what exactly you were willing to lose. She looked down at her hand on the envelope, at the swell beneath her ribs. Okay, she said, and the single word felt like stepping onto a bridge whose planks weren't yet secured. We start quiet. Outside counsel. We split holdings. We identify loyal hands. We do not tell the board yet. Silas's expression registered the slightest relief. Jonah sagged like a man allowed to breathe. For a moment, short and razor-sharp, Mara felt the fragile scaffolding of choice beneath her feet. She had chosen a course that would force her into rooms she had never wanted to enter, with men who would test the metal in her bones. As they parted, Silas's bike kicked to life, and his taillights blinked red in the wet dawn. Jonah slid beside Mara, his breath warm against her ear. I know you're angry, he said. I know I ran. I know I left you when you needed someone to stand. But I'm back, and I can learn. I can change. Let me. Mara watched him, the man who'd tried to be nothing and become everything. She could feel the beat of the baby like a stubborn drum. The ledger was a world of danger and of possibilities. The road ahead branched, wet and treacherous, lined with choices and men who would judge them for each one. She tucked the envelope inside her coat, a small movement of ownership. Well, move fast, she told him, and quietly. If I have to be a lighthouse, it will be my fire, not theirs. He nodded. Then we'll keep the bellows to ourselves. They walked inside together, but each step felt like a wager. Behind them, the strip stretched awake, tending its own wounds and secrets. Somewhere, a rival chapter was probably rolling toward a news story or a rumor. Somewhere, federal agents might be marking ledgers like they'd mark crime scenes. The world's edges had sharpened. Mara climbed the narrow stairs to her office, a space that smelt of old receipts and stronger coffee, and laid the ledger on the desk like setting a newborn onto a table to be measured. Her hands trembled, but the tremble was part of the work now. She had to learn to steady herself not just for her father's name or for Silas' expectations, but for a life that had been made sudden and heavy by paper and by the sound of engines. She thought of the strip and of the men who slept with patches turned inward. She thought of Jonah's hands and of the baby inside her, and remembered her father's voice saying once, gruff and affectionate, "The road takes what it's owed. You pay or you get paid." Now the ledger meant she had more than debts to pay. She had a ledger of obligations and possibilities. The first choice had been made. She would not be a puppet. She would not be a passive name on a document. She would learn the syntax of accounts. She would build allies. She would teach Jonah that staying can be a weapon as well as leaving. She would keep the baby safe. And if men wanted to test her, she would show them that a Kincaid could handle fire without burning the ones she loved. Outside, a bike roared and faded down the road. Inside, the ledger lay open like a map. The first of many decisions had been claimed. They called it a ledger because numbers sounded cleaner than names. But Mara had started to learn that numbers only hide violence in plain sight. They were thin walls between people and ruin. The week that followed the funeral became a private war of whispers and cameras, of men in suits who smelled of cigarettes and men in patches who smelled like old rain. Each morning she woke to another subtle betrayal. A favor offered with a hidden clause, a friend who hesitated when she asked a question, a prospect who suddenly had reasons to be elsewhere. The first fracture came from an unexpected direction. 2 days after she had refused the board's first offer, the woman who ran the diner across from the strip, Rose, a heavy-set woman with hair like corn silk and a temper that had once broken up a fistfight with a single look, found her on the porch with a paper cup of coffee cooling between her hands. Rose's face was gray under the light. She dropped into the chair opposite Mara with the gracelessness of someone who'd carried a worry too long. "They were here last night," Rose said without preamble. "2 men in black suits. Not federal, local. They asked about you, about donations to charities. Asked if my place ever bought supplies from any of Kincaid's shell companies." Mara's mouth went dry. "Did you lie?" Rose blinked. The woman's hands, broad and reliable, folded around her cup. "I told them I thought you were private. I said I didn't know who handled your paper." She stopped, then smiled with the sort of rue that meant she'd lied but with reason. "I said Kincaid money goes where it's needed. But they had a file, a number, a name attached." "Did they say who sent them?" Mara asked. Rose shrugged. "They said they're just curious. But men in suits don't ask out of curiosity. They ask because someone points a lamp at them. Someone's starting a trail." That night, Mara lay awake imagining lanterns sweeping the streets, revealing the dark seams of her father's life. Every ledger line became a riddle. Payoffs to councils that governed more than permits, transfers to companies that existed in mailboxes rented in states she'd never visited, donations to causes that seemed laudable until you traced one thin wire and found a dead man. The deeper she read, the more she realized how tangled her father's world had become. His carefulness had been genius and also a trap. Silas's patience began to fray. His texts grew terse. "We need movement. Council must be engaged. Who are you talking to?" He came by less as a protector and more as a monitor. His patience wound tight. Prospects were asked to shadow Mara's movements under the guise of concern. A coffee run, a walk, a phone call. Men who had once bought her beers now logged into accounts she didn't know existed and made notes. The Patch had always been family. Now family had become an intelligence unit. It should have been comforting, the idea that the club watched over its own. Instead, it felt like a net. Jonah argued the other side with a slow heat he rarely employed. Protectors were sometimes the most dangerous because they had written prejudice into their idea of love. "They're watching you because they don't trust you," he said one midnight, voice flat with exhaustion. "Not because they want to help. They want to control." Mara wanted to strike at the simplicity of the words. Control, protect, love. They braided together in the club like the threads of a rope. She felt both tied and held. Then, the ledger leaked. It was a slip so small it could have been accidental. An insecure email from the probate firm to a junior associate that named a corporation and one of the shell trusts. The associate forwarded it for advice to a friend who had a loose tongue and a hunger for significance. A week later, one of Mara's old brother's prospects showed her a printed copy of a social media post. A screenshot of the email, circled entries, a comment thread filled with speculation. The club exploded. Men who had been calm as stone during the funeral paced their rooms like caged animals. Phones blinked. Silas' office filled with shouts over the line. Men banged on Mara's door asking what she knew. Some asked where she had sent the funds. The trust's name became a talisman in every conversation, a thing to be pressed into palms and judged. Men who had smiled at her for years now muttered about stewardship and whether a woman was equipped to hold what her father had built. Their loyalty sounded like a contract being renegotiated. Mara felt naked under the glare. Jonah stood by her like a weathered signpost, steady but uneven. He moved beside her with a new stubbornness, the kind that no longer sought permission to be present. He listened and he learned. He stayed up nights poring over the ledger until his eyes reddened, asking questions that made Mara see lines in the documents she'd missed. He wanted to hold her by being useful, and sometimes that usefulness was the only balm in a room full of knives. Secrets rose like bilge water. A woman in a neighboring chapter, someone Mara had danced with once at a patch barbecue, came forward with a story of a loan her husband had taken from one of the shell companies and how it had been called in under suspicious circumstances. A retired accountant with a limp told Jonah in a bar that he had seen entries in the ledger that indicated payouts to a name that matched the owner of a scrapyard used by a rival patch 2 towns over. Each revelation was a new fracture, widening the gap between what Mara believed about her father and what his ledger suggested. At the heart of the unraveling was a single truth no amount of arithmetic could soften. Power attracts predators. Whether they wore suits or patches didn't matter. Men with ledgers wanted security to look like charity. Men with patches wanted security to look like legacy. Mara had become the fulcrum, whether she liked it or not. The first real betrayal from inside came from a man she had trusted, one of her father's oldest prospects, Rory Lane. Rory had been a baby-faced kid who learned how to tune a carburetor under her father's watchful eye. He'd cried at the funeral in a way that made Mara's own heart fold. He'd promised her he would be loyal. Loyalty in the patch has weight, and sometimes it crushes. Rory called her late one evening, and at first his voice was hushed, as if he spoke from a confession booth. He said he'd been approached by men from a rival patch with an offer. They could guarantee protection if he helped them access one of the trust's front companies. He said he tried to refuse. He said he had feared for his family's safety. The way he said family made Mara understand immediately that fear was the same currency for everyone. "You should have told me," Mara said, feeling the betrayal as a physical strike. "I thought I could handle it," Rory replied. "I thought I could protect my woman. They knew about the trust already. They're moving fast. Please." Please what? Bend? Break? Her tone shocked her. She had been taught to look after the downtrodden in the club, that life might not break them further, but she had also learned the hard way that mercy misapplied invites violence. Rory's voice splintered. "I didn't want to pick sides." "Then don't," Mara said, her voice a thin wire of control. "Don't pick sides. Pick safety. Move your family out of the neighborhood if you have to. Tell them nothing. Keep your hands clean." "You ask me to lie to my brothers," Rory protested. "No," Mara's words were softer. "I ask you to stay alive." He hung up without saying goodbye.
Mara realized that the fractures were not simply between the board and her or between Silas and Jonah. They cut through brothers and prospects and women with names like Rose. The ledger had become a chisel, and every man who touched it was breaking off pieces. Silas tried to hold the center. He convened a meeting in the back room of the Strip under the neon glow that had seen better days. He spoke in calm, measured tones, laying out options like a general marshaling troops. He argued for a partnership with outside counsel that had experience in corporate veil matters. He pushed for publicly visible investments to act as a shield. He offered men roles in new enterprises so they would have stakes in lawfulness rather than the old ways. The plan was political and pragmatic. But even as Silas spoke, another truth cut through. One of the men in the room, Thomas Burke, a high-ranking officer known for his quick temper, quietly slid Mara a folded note. She unfolded it later when the meeting ended and found a list of names and bank numbers. But at the bottom, someone had scrawled a threat: "Trust no suit that calls itself clean." Mara's stomach dropped. A man she had once loved had scribbled a warning that felt like both advice and accusation. It implied that cleaning the club meant erasing the living memory of how they had survived. It implied that some men would rather burn everything than let it change hands to lawyers and accountants. She had to accept that not everyone was working toward her child's safety. The fractures widened the night a car rammed through the front of the Strip. It was a truck, engine screaming, glass spraying like ice. No one was killed, but a prospect Mara had given a job to, Luis, a broad-shouldered kid who'd been trying to pull himself off the streets, was pinned under metal until Jonah, Silas, and two others pried the door open and pulled him out. The arson attempt was clumsy, as if the men who launched it had wanted terror more than a clean hit. Luis survived with a broken arm and a heart that would take longer to mend. When Mara saw him in the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and burnt plastic clung to the air like a new kind of smoke. Luis's eyes were wide and bright with fear, but the fear was for her as much as for himself. "They said someone inside," he told her, voice thin with pain. "Someone told them about the trust, said you were the key." Mara's hands wanted to shake. A prospect almost dead was a fracture in itself because it demanded a response beyond whispers. The attack forced truth into daylight. The trust made people desperate and desperate men violent. It made loyalties conditional. A meeting convened that night, not in the Strip, but in a warehouse outside town, where the cold made every decision sharper. Men argued with the kind of desperation that insists on being the author of its own destiny. Silas proposed bringing in outside security firms. Jonah argued for a quieter approach, moving assets and shielding names. Mara sat between them, ledger like a cold sun on her lap. Then Silas, in a quiet voice that was almost a confession, said something that cracked the room. "Your father didn't make this alone." The phrase hung like smoke. Heads turned. Mara's breath stuttered. "What do you mean?" Silas's fingers drummed on the table. There were partners. Not all of them patch-affiliated. Some were businesses, men who offered services. Others were local politicians. Some were organizations who got funding in exchange for silence. He relied on favors. He made enemies. And on the night of the fire, we found signs that suggested someone else was involved.
Someone? Jonah echoed, his jaw tight. An accelerant signature, Silas said, and someone who knew how to trigger it without being traced. Booking showed no outsiders in the building, but not everything is recorded. His eyes were hard.
There are men who were on your father's payroll who don't answer for him now. They answer to someone else. The idea that her father's web had threads reaching into places Mara didn't know how to name made the room feel foreign. Betrayal, she realized, wasn't always a single act. It was a network of small treasons, and the ledger was the map. After the meeting, as they walked back into the rain, Jonas stopped and took Mara's hand. "You wanted to know the truth," he said. "We have it now." She looked at him, at the man who'd once fled and came back, and felt again that prickly blend of anger and gratitude. "The truth costs us everything," she said. "It costs loyalty, it costs safety, it might cost lives." Jonah's thumb drew a line across her knuckles. "Then we make it worth the cost." She thought of her father's laugh, of the ledger on the table in her office that was slowly revealing not just his generosity and cunning, but his deaths and betrayals. She thought of Lewis in the hospital, and Rory's frightened voice, and the men in suits with files. Shadows were everywhere now. Some she could illuminate, others would remain in the ductwork of life. Promises nodded in the cold air. Jonas' vow to stand, Silas's promise to help if she played the board correctly, and Mara's own commitment to the baby whose name she hadn't picked yet. She had wanted a quiet life once, a simple marriage, a mechanic's garage, and a crib. Instead, the ledger had made her a prize and a target. The cracks in alliances widened into rifts that night. Some men declared they would stand by Mara no matter what. Others whispered they would only stand with whoever could secure the ledger. Loyalties began to trade like currency. The club, which had once been a family, was now a market where affection could be bought by power. Mara sat in the dim of her office, the ledger open like a small, relentless moon. She could feel the fractures running through everything she loved. Trust was splintering under the strain, and she realized with a cold clarity that secrets would break her if she didn't fracture them first. She would have to choose which alliances to mend and which to let go, who to forgive and who to cut loose. She would have to learn to weaponize transparency and to hide in plain sight. And she would have to keep a promise, that the baby inside her would inherit a world where their mother's name meant something other than a war. Mara walked into the warehouse like someone entering a confession. Rain stitched the night to the floorboards, and the men who had gathered there shifted when she crossed the room, some with suspicion, some with resignation. She laid the ledger on the table and watched the light catch the paper like a blade. "No more leaks," she said, voice flat. "We close ranks, but not in a way that hands the keys to men who'll sell us out." Silas folded his hands, the quiet of his posture a kind of armor. Jonah stood at Mara's shoulder, steady as a lug wrench. The prospect, Luis, sat propped in a chair, his arm in a sling and his jaw set like a man learning to hold anger in place. Mara met each face and then fixed the room with the one they all avoided, Rory Lanes. Rory's eyes were hollowed out by fear. "They came again," he said, "last night. Said they'd give us protection if we gave them access codes. They said they'd make it clean, lawyers, bank transfers. They showed me pictures of my family." Mara's chest clenched. "Who?" she asked. "Two men," Rory whispered. "A suit and a man with no patch. He wore plain boots and had a ring, silver, a lion. They said they'd been sent by Moran." Silas' jaw tightened. Moran was a rival with pockets that could choke a city. "If Moran is moving, he thinks we blinked," Silas said. "We cannot let him think he can buy us." "Then we don't blink," Mara said. Her voice was a match struck. "We show him what he can't buy." Her plan was simple and dangerous, bait and claim.
She'd use herself as the ledger's decoy, but not by giving it to the board or to Moran. She'd place a controlled sum in the open market, visible funds funneled into a nonprofit that repaired veterans' bikes, while the larger trust moved under layers Jonah and she would orchestrate. The public money would be a promise. The hidden funds would be a fortress. It required time, precision, and a sacrifice. Someone had to wear the blame if the public portion appeared tainted. Jonas shook his head before she finished. "You're not letting me be the one who takes heat for the front," he said. Her hand found his. It wasn't a refusal, it was a weighing of choices. If they trace the front and find it's a play, they'll press public charges. The club will want to protect itself, and that means a scapegoat. I won't be the woman they hang on a hook to save a board. Jonas' face didn't change. "Then I will," he said. Silence struck like rain. He straightened, as if steeling for a task that would pull the life from him and make him a martyr. "I can make them believe I laundered the funds. I can take the interviews, the pressure. I'll sign affidavits and be the guilty hand. They'll look at me, the mechanic, before they look at you, Mara Kincaid." Mara felt the world tilt. "You will not throw yourself into a cell for me," she snapped. But the fierceness of love in her words undercut the anger. Jonas' face was a map of decisions he'd already made. "I left," he said quietly. "I can make up for it. Let me protect you the way you deserve. Let me be the one they hammer at. I'll wear the anger. You secure the assets. You keep the ledger and the child." Silas looked as if he'd been struck. Part of him, the keeper of rules, bristled at the idea of a man bearing crafted guilt. Part of him, a sentinel used to sacrifices, recognized the strategic mercy of Jonas' choice. "You're asking me to throw him to wolves," Silas said, voice low. "I'm asking you to see a different calculus," Mara replied. "Jonah will not be alone. We'll have counsel. We stage the narrative, we prepare statements, and we move the real money in the background. It's a theater, but it's theater that buys us time." The men argued into the small hours, voices rising and falling like engines in a long stretch of road. Lawyers were called, safe accounts secured, and a cleaned public donation crafted to look clumsy enough to be believable if someone wanted to point fingers. Jonah practiced his confession. How he would have met a suit, how he'd been tempted, how his fear had made him greedy. He rehearsed shame until it sat like a cloak on his shoulders. The night before the staged leak, Mara couldn't sleep. Jonah watched her from the doorway, eyes rimmed red. "Promise me one thing," he said. Her answer was immediate. "Stay alive." He laughed, a short, wet sound. "That's not the thing." She waited. "Promise me you won't sign anything that gives them the ledger," he said. "Promise me you won't let Silas or the board make you a puppet. Promise me you'll keep the baby and yourself first." Mara's throat closed. She placed her palm on his cheek, feeling the roughness of a life that had learned to be useful. "I promise." In the morning, they performed. Jonah took a staged meeting with a planted informant. Cameras, quiet, legal, caused him signing papers and accepting cash. A 2-day media drip fed the rumor mill. The club could claim plausible deniability because the apparent conduit was a man outside the board. The ledger, meanwhile, smeared in layers of legitimate trusts and offshore accounts, moved in ways that no single journalist or prosecutor could pin without deeper pursuit. The cost was immediate. Fingers were pointed. Jonah faced threats that smelled of metal and fury. The club rallied, but not all came to his defense. Some men cheered inwardly. Others vowed vengeance. Jonah stood with bruises blooming where words had hit him, where loyalty had been tested. When Moran's men made a move, an attempted kidnapping at the warehouse, Jonah was ready. He didn't flee when a hand reached for Mara. He stepped between them, his body a shield. He took a blow meant for her, an old reflex of men who chose to stand. The bullet that grazed his shoulder was a new kind of pain.
The bruise across his ribs was a ledger in flesh. Mara watched him crumple and felt a rage translate into a clarity she had only begun to inhabit. She grabbed the gun from a man who'd fired and pointed it not at Moran's men, but at the decision she would make henceforth. No more passive roles. No more being a name for someone else to trade. She fired a warning shot into the air, a sound that split the night. And in that crack, she found her voice. "This ends now," she said, the ledger heavy in a bag slung over her shoulder. "You want money? Well, spend it on the strip, on clinics, on jobs. You want control? You get accountability. You want to buy us? You buy the whole town." Moran's lieutenant hesitated. In that pause, Silas moved like a force of nature, older, meaner, and terrifyingly loyal. He delivered a single word that acted like a verdict. "Back." The men withdrew, not because they had been bested in firepower, but because they recognized the consequence of a woman willing to lead and a man who had chosen sacrifice. Jonah bled, but he breathed. Mara knelt at his side, hands shaking, and pressed his wound with something older than patch or ledger, love that chose danger because it had nothing left to prove. They tended wounds in one another's palms, Jonah admitting his cowardice and offering his courage now, Mara accepting that she could not hold the ledger without offering a heart in return. Silas, watching those hands, realized the equation was changing. Stewardship would not be a title men forced upon her. It would be a power she would wield, bruised and honest. By dawn, the staged narrative held. Moran's men stewed in their defeat, regrouping perhaps, but stymied. The board saw Jonah's sacrifice and, unwilling to be publicly seen as complicit, softened their overtures. They offered Mara a council seat, not as a figurehead, but as steward with veto power and legal autonomy, contingent on certain public-facing investments and an independent trustee. Mara looked at Jonah, at the bruise blooming under his collarbone like a medal. He had given himself to protect a plan they had cooked in the dark together. She wiped blood from his mouth with her thumb and kissed him, first as gratitude and then as renewal. The kiss tasted of diesel and rain and the hard promise of new work. "You didn't have to," she murmured. "I did," he said, "because I love you, because I couldn't leave you again." She believed him. She also knew the ledger would continue to attract vultures, but now she had a choice, to run or to stand. She chose to stand, with Jonah at her side and Silas held, for the moment, in watchful truce. The redemption was not absolute. It cost Jonah pain and public scorn, and it forced Mara into rooms she had never wanted to enter. But the claim was hers, not merely of money, but of authority, of a life she would fiercely guard for the child inside her. They had paid a price, but they had paid it together. Morning came soft and thin, like a promise you were not sure you deserved. The board's offer settled into the edges of the day. A council seat with veto and an independent trustee, public investments they could point to, and a private path Mara and Jonah had carved through offshore veils. It was compromise edged with teeth, but it was a beginning. Mara signed the papers at noon with Jonah's hand folded over hers. His thumb stroked the back of her hand like a benediction. They rebuilt slowly. The strip received its first legal donation, a program for veterans who repaired bikes and learned trades, its ribbon cut under the blue glare of a sky that had learned to forgive rain. The visible fund was small and clumsy by design. Taxes and audits would parade around it and see nothing but paperwork and goodwill. The hidden holdings unspooled according to Mara's plan, layer by layer, into trusts and foundations that paid salaries, bought leases, and fenced assets away from predatory hands. She kept the ledger in a safe she alone could open, a ritual that steadied her in sleepless hours. Jonah read balance sheets like a man learning a new language, his hand steady on each page. He learned council strategy and when to be silent. He learned to translate patch talk to legalese and back. He bore the public scars, questions in bars, sideways looks at meetings. But the club, slow and animal, began to accept that sacrifice and bravery could come in a greasy package. Silas stood at Mara's flank, still wary, still a sentinel, but his respect deepened into something like collaboration. They mourned otherwise. Rory entered witness protection after testifying about approach attempts. Luis healed and returned to the strip with a limp and a laugh that sounded like victory. Moran retreated to lick wounds. Federal inquiries circled but found only well-laid paper and cautiously innocent accountants. The ledger kept its darker edges, but the worst blows had been met and softened by planning and stubborn love. In the evenings, Mara sat on the back of Jonah's bike with her belly against the curve of his spine, and they rode the outer back roads where the world narrowed to engine and horizon. Sometimes they swam in silence. Sometimes they argued like old lovers, sharp and intimate. They taught each other courage. Jonah taught steady hands. Mara taught choosing a fight daily.
When the baby came, early, fierce, and swaddled in a patched blanket from the strip, the room filled with a peace that was not absence of danger, but presence of chosen protection. Mara watched Jonah cradle their child and felt her heart uncoil. The ledger remained on a shelf, a guardrail behind them, but it no longer defined them. On a clear night months later, they stood at the strip's edge and watched a pack of bikes roll by, chrome with small moons. Jonah wrapped an arm around Mara. She leaned into him, the baby sleeping inside her arms, now a person whose first breaths were taken under their watch. The road lay ahead, still dangerous, still brilliant. They had not tamed it. They had learned to ride it together.